The courtroom was heavy with tension, as though the very walls were absorbing the weight of what was unfolding inside. The air smelled faintly of polished wood, old paper, and nervous sweat, the particular scent of places where truth and lies were forced to wrestle in public. Ceiling fans turned lazily, moving the air just enough to stir the pages of the stenographer's notes. Outside, the world moved on, cars honking in the distance, people hurrying about their daily routines. But inside these four walls, time seemed to slow, every movement, every sound magnified into significance. The judge presided from his raised bench, his expression stern but weary. He had seen countless trials, watched endless parades of witnesses, lawyers and defendants. He had grown used to lies dressed as truth, and truth drowned out by clever argument. But this case had unsettled him from the start. It wasn't just the nature of the crime. It was the undercurrent, something intangible yet unmistakable, that made his chest tighten every time he looked at the defendant. At the prosecution's side sat a German shepherd, calm but alert, his massive head resting between his paws. His fur gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a golden-brown coat streaked with black. The badge on his harness read, K9 Unit. To most, he was just another police dog, brought in to remind the jury of the evidence he had uncovered. But to those who knew him, he was more than that. He had a reputation, one built on instincts that often seemed to surpass logic, instincts that had solved cases when humans could not. Across the aisle, the defense team shuffled papers, their faces hard with concentration. Their client, the defendant, sat stiffly, eyes darting occasionally toward the dog. When he did, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. No one else seemed to notice, but the handler did. Years of working with the K9 had taught him to trust the little things, twitches, flinches, the quick dart of eyes. The dog noticed too. His ears flicked, his body tensed, though he remained obediently still. At the back of the courtroom, a young mother struggled to keep her toddler quiet. The little girl, no more than 3 years old, swung her legs restlessly, her small shoes tapping the wooden bench. She tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering questions too softly for anyone else to hear. The mother, embarrassed, offered snacks, toys, even her phone, but nothing seemed to hold the child's attention for long. The courtroom was no place for children, and more than a few heads turned with disapproval. But then something shifted. The toddler froze mid-swing, her wide eyes fixing on something across the room. She stopped fidgeting, her little hand resting on her mother's arm. Slowly, almost cautiously, she leaned forward, her gaze locked on the German shepherd lying near the prosecutor's table. The dog raised his head. It wasn't unusual for him to scan the room. He was trained to be alert, but this was different. His dark eyes met the child's, and he didn't look away. His ears perked, body shifting slightly forward, as though acknowledging her presence. The handler frowned, giving the leash a gentle tug, the signal for focus. Normally, the dog responded instantly, redirecting his attention to the task at hand. But today, he ignored the cue. He kept staring at the child. A silence stretched. The little girl tilted her head, mirroring the dog's posture in uncanny mimicry. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but wasn't sure she should. Her mother noticed, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Sit still, honey," she whispered, but the toddler didn't move. Her attention was entirely consumed by the animal before her, as if some invisible thread had tied the two together. Whispers began to ripple through the gallery. At first, they were about the child's restlessness, but soon people noticed the dog's unwavering stare. A juror nudged another. One reporter leaned forward, scribbling furiously, sensing a story within the story. Even the judge, mid-note, glanced up to see the silent exchange. His brows knitted together, uncertain whether to dismiss it as coincidence or mark it as significant. The prosecution tried to carry on, the attorney pacing before. The jury, outlining details from a witness statement. But the room's focus had shifted. Eyes darted back and forth between the child and the dog, between innocence and discipline, between two beings who seemed to recognize something the adults could not. The defendant shifted in his seat. He cleared his throat, straightened his tie, and forced his gaze forward. But his hand twitched against the table, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his pen. The handler didn't miss it. Neither did the dog. A low rumble vibrated in the shepherd's chest, not loud enough to be called a growl, but not silent either. The handler's pulse quickened. This was not standard behavior. The dog was disciplined, highly trained, conditioned to remain calm, unless given a command or triggered by something unmistakable. But here he was, responding not to a scent or signal, but to the gaze of a toddler. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, bringing the room back to order. "Let's stay focused," he said, though his voice lacked its usual firmness. Something about the scene unsettled him. He had no place for superstition, but he had long ago learned that the truth had a way of slipping through cracks, revealing itself in unexpected ways. And what he saw now, a child locked in a silent exchange with a police dog, felt like one of those cracks. The toddler finally broke her stillness. She leaned closer to her mother and tugged on her sleeve. "Mommy," she whispered, though the word carried farther than she realized. Her eyes never left the German shepherd. Her voice was filled not with fear, but certainty, the kind only children could possess. Her mother hushed her quickly, pressing a finger to her lips. Not now. But the dog remained alert, ears forward, muscles taut beneath his sleek coat. He wasn't just watching anymore. He was waiting. And though no one could fully explain it, everyone in that courtroom felt the same shiver run through them. Something unusual had begun, something that would soon unravel the carefully constructed walls of arguments, objections, and evidence. The child, too young to understand the stakes, and the dog, trained to detect truths beyond human senses, had recognized one another. The trial would go on. Witnesses would testify. Lawyers would argue. But from that moment, nothing about the atmosphere remained the same. The silent connection between a toddler and a dog had shifted the room, leaving everyone uneasy, as if destiny itself had just entered the courtroom. A mother tried once more to pull her daughter's attention away, offering her a juice box, a toy, anything to distract her. But the toddler ignored it all. She was still staring, eyes wide, lips trembling with words she hadn't yet spoken. The German shepherd lowered his head slightly, as though waiting for her, and the courtroom, filled with the hum of law and order, seemed to hold its breath. The courtroom was designed to suppress emotion. Its high ceilings, pale walls, and rigid benches gave the impression that everything within its space had to bend before the cold authority of the law. And yet, as the afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, the room vibrated with an undercurrent no one could ignore. It wasn't the prosecutor's measured voice or the shuffle of papers. It was something else, something quieter, yet far more powerful. A toddler was staring at a dog. It should have been an innocent thing, easily dismissed. Children stared at all sorts of things. But the way she looked at him, wide-eyed, unblinking, her small hands gripping the edge of the bench, felt different, as if she saw something the adults were blind to. And the way the police dog looked back, ears pricked forward, body perfectly still, only heightened the strangeness of it all. The handler shifted uneasily in his chair. He gave a subtle tug on the dog's leash, the familiar signal to redirect attention. But the dog didn't obey. Normally, he was the picture of discipline, responding to every command with flawless precision. Today, though, he ignored it completely. His eyes remained locked on the child, as though something unspoken, had passed between them. The mother noticed too. She tugged at her daughter's arm, whispering, "Sit still, sweetheart. Don't bother the nice doggy." She pulled a granola bar from her bag and offered it as a distraction, but the girl brushed it aside. Her entire world had narrowed to the animal watching her from across the room. It was then that the whispers began. "Why's the dog staring like that?" one juror murmured to another. "Does he know the kid?" a reporter whispered to his colleague, pen scratching across his notepad. "Never seen him break focus," one officer muttered under his breath, eyes narrowing. Even the judge, who prided himself on maintaining order above all else, couldn't ignore it. He cleared his throat, shifting in his chair. For a brief moment, he stopped writing notes and allowed his gaze to wander toward the back of the courtroom. His eyes landed on the little girl, her small frame dwarfed by the bench, her face glowing with something between awe and certainty. He followed her gaze to the dog, still locked, still unmoving. A strange prickle ran down his spine. The defense attorney noticed the change in atmosphere and scoffed audibly, trying to cut through the tension. "Your Honor, may I remind the court that distractions in the gallery should not be allowed to interfere with these proceedings?" His voice dripped with irritation, his glance sharp toward the mother and child. But before the judge could reply, the prosecutor raised a hand, his own attention drawn to the odd exchange. "With respect, counsel," he said evenly, "the distraction does not appear to be coming from the child alone." He gestured toward the German shepherd, whose leash was taut, muscles braced, as if waiting for a command that never came. The courtroom shifted again, unease rippling like a current beneath calm waters. The defendant, who had sat stone-faced through most of the trial, shifted uncomfortably. His fingers tapped the table, his shoulders tight. He avoided looking at the dog, but the avoidance itself betrayed him. The more he tried to remain still, the more obvious it became that he was unsettled. And that was when the little girl leaned forward, tilting her head to mirror the dog's posture. It was almost eerie, the way she seemed to mimic him without realizing it. Her lips moved, soundless at first, as if practicing words she was too nervous to say aloud. The handler's stomach tightened. He'd worked with this K9 long enough to know his instincts bordered on uncanny. The dog didn't fixate without reason. He didn't break training unless something tugged at him so strongly it overpowered years of conditioning. And now, paired with this child's strange behavior, it was beginning to feel less like coincidence and more like connection. The prosecutor attempted to continue with his questioning of the witness, but the words fell flat. Half the jury was distracted, eyes darting back to the girl every few seconds. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, their stories already shifting in focus. Something remarkable was happening here, something beyond evidence and legal arguments. The defendant exhaled heavily, his breath audible even in the hush of the courtroom. His attorney leaned in, whispering sharply, urging him to keep his composure. But the damage was done. His leg bounced under the table, his hand clenched into a fist. The toddler's gaze hadn't wavered. Neither had the dog's. "Order," the judge said at last, tapping his gavel, though his voice lacked its usual command. He wasn't sure if he wanted order or simply a moment to process what he was seeing. He had presided over trials where emotion clouded judgment, where theatrics threatened justice. But this wasn't theatrics. This was something else, something raw, and it left him unsettled in a way he couldn't explain. The mother, cheeks flushed with embarrassment, bent down to whisper in her daughter's ear, "Sweetheart, please stop staring. You're making people nervous." But the little girl didn't respond. She blinked once, then twice, her eyes wide with the kind of sincerity only a child could hold. Slowly, she whispered back, her voice just loud enough to carry to the rows ahead of her, "Doggy knows." The words were simple, but they landed like a thunderclap. The prosecutor froze mid-question. The jurors stiffened, eyes widening. Even the stenographer hesitated before typing, as if unsure whether those words belonged in the official record. The German shepherd stood. Not abruptly. He rose with controlled precision, but the movement drew every eye to him. His ears pricked. Higher, his gaze sharpening, as if the child's words had given him permission to act. His handler's grip tightened on the leash, but the tension in the line revealed how badly the dog wanted to move. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp against the wood. "Order!" He barked, but his voice cracked slightly, betraying the tremor in his chest. His eyes darted from the girl to the dog, then finally, reluctantly, to the defendant. For the first time since the trial began, the defendant looked afraid. No one could explain it yet. No one could connect the dots in a way that fit neatly into the rule of law. But instinctively, everyone in that courtroom understood something monumental had just shifted. A toddler had spoken. A dog had responded. And together they had pierced through the cold, rigid silence of justice with something far more powerful: truth. And though the lawyers tried to resume their questioning, though the judge tried to reassert control, no one in that room could truly focus on the trial anymore. Their eyes returned again and again to the back bench where a child sat whispering to her mother, and to the police dog who refused to break his gaze. The bond between them was undeniable, and for reasons no one yet understood, it terrified the man on trial. The prosecutor's voice echoed across the room, measured and steady, as he questioned the witness on the stand. It was the rhythm of trial work: questions, answers, objections, rulings, a cadence the courtroom had heard many times before. But underneath that familiar pattern, tension simmered like a storm, threatening to break. The dog hadn't moved. He sat upright now, ears pointed forward, gaze unyielding. The handler's hand tightened on the leash, sweat beginning to bead at his temple. Every muscle in the German shepherd's body was taut, not with aggression, but with focus. It was the kind of posture the handler had learned not to ignore. Across the room, the little girl remained on her feet. She was too young to understand rules of decorum, too innocent to recognize the weight of silence she was about to shatter. But children had a way of seeing what adults missed, and her world had narrowed to the large animal across the courtroom. Then it happened. "Doggy knows." The words were barely above a whisper, but they cut through the air with the clarity of a shout. Every sound in the courtroom stopped. The prosecutor's question died on his lips. The witness blinked, startled. A juror's pen froze mid-stroke. Even the ceiling fans seemed to slow, as if the entire room had paused to hear her words. The mother's face turned crimson. She reached to pull her daughter back down onto the bench, hissing, "Quiet, sweetheart, please." But the damage was done. The words had been spoken. The judge leaned back in his chair, lips pressed into a thin line. He wasn't sure if he should admonish the mother, clear the gallery, or simply ignore it. Yet something about those two words rooted him to the spot. He had presided over hundreds of cases, heard expert witnesses and tearful victims, lies delivered, with the confidence of truth and truths dismissed as fantasy. But never had he seen a 3-year-old child interrupt the solemnity of a trial with such quiet certainty. The jurors exchanged glances, some frowning, others wide-eyed. A few scribbled notes, though what they were recording, no one could say. Reporters sat forward, pens flying across their notepads, sensing this was a moment that would make headlines no matter the outcome. The dog's reaction only added to the weight of it. His ears twitched, his eyes sharpened. His tail, still, moments before, gave one stiff thump against the floor. Then he leaned forward, straining against the leash just slightly, enough that the handler had to brace himself. It wasn't aggression. It was recognition. The handler's heart pounded. This was no coincidence. He knew this dog better than anyone. He knew the signals, the body language, the subtle cues that separated boredom from focus, curiosity from certainty. And what he was seeing now was something rare. The unmistakable indication that the dog believed the child was onto something. The defense attorney sprang to his feet. Objection. He barked, his voice sharp with panic rather than precision. This is highly irregular. A child making random statements cannot be considered evidence in this court. But his objection rang hollow. He wasn't simply objecting to the words. He was objecting to the way the atmosphere had shifted against him. The prosecutor remained silent, almost as stunned as everyone else. For once, his carefully crafted arguments and rehearsed lines seemed irrelevant. The spotlight had moved to a child no one had expected to matter, and a dog no one could ignore. The defendant fidgeted in his chair. He adjusted his tie, licked his lips, and forced his gaze down at the table. But the avoidance was obvious. Sweat beaded on his forehead, a droplet sliding down his temple. He picked up his pen, then set it down again. His composure, carefully maintained through weeks of testimony, was unraveling. The judge cleared his throat. "Order," he said, but his voice lacked its usual bite. He tapped his gavel once, almost absent-mindedly. His eyes drifted again to the child. She wasn't fidgeting now. She wasn't distracted or restless like other children brought unwillingly into such places. She was calm, still, focused, and that, perhaps, was the most unnerving part of all. "Doggy knows," she repeated, softer this time, as though confirming her earlier statement. The mother buried her face in her hands, torn between embarrassment and confusion. She tried to hush her daughter again, but the girl shook her head, her curls bouncing with the movement. She didn't understand why no one was listening. To her, the truth was simple. The dog knows. The handler swallowed hard, glancing toward the prosecutor. He debated whether to speak, to explain what he believed his partner was signaling. But the weight of courtroom procedure held him back. Speaking out of turn could jeopardize the case. And yet, sitting silently while the moment passed felt just as dangerous. The tension stretched so thick it seemed like the air itself might snap. Finally, the judge leaned forward, his hands steepled beneath his chin. His eyes locked on the handler. "Officer," he said slowly, "is there a reason your canine is behaving in this manner?" The handler hesitated. "Your Honor, he's trained to remain calm unless he detects something significant. In my years with him, I've only seen this reaction in circumstances tied to evidence, strong evidence." A murmur rippled across the room. The defense attorney shot to his feet again. "Your Honor, this is absurd. Are we to put a dog on the witness stand now? Shall we let toddlers testify instead of experts?" His voice cracked with frustration, his bravado faltering under the shifting weight of the room. But no one laughed. No one dismissed it. The jurors remained locked in their seats, their eyes drawn again and again to the strange pair, the girl and the dog, whose connection seemed undeniable. The judge rapped his gavel again. "Enough," he said firmly, though his own mind was spinning. He turned to the jurors. "Disregard the comment from the gallery." But even as he said the words, he knew they were futile. Words once spoken could not be unheard. And in that moment, everyone in the courtroom knew this trial had changed course. The silence was unbearable. It wasn't the dignified quiet of a courtroom following order, but the heavy, suffocating kind, the kind that pressed against the chest and made breathing feel like betrayal. Every eye shifted between two unlikely figures, a child barely out of toddlerhood and a police dog trained for precision, now united by something no one could explain. The dog's chest rose and fell, steady but deliberate. His amber eyes locked onto the defendant. His handler, Officer Daniels, felt the leash quiver with tension, a living current traveling from the animal to his own racing heart. This wasn't coincidence. Daniels had partnered with Shadow for 4 years. He had seen the dog track suspects across miles of woodland, uncover narcotics hidden in the most unlikely places, and even locate a missing child when all human efforts had failed. But this was different. Shadow wasn't sniffing the air or pulling toward an object. He was staring, fixated, reading the defendant as though the man were a book whose lies could no longer stay bound. The toddler's words replayed in Daniel's mind, "Doggy knows." The judge's gavel tapped against the wood again, sharper this time. "Control your animal, officer," he ordered, though his voice betrayed the tremor of unease. Daniels nodded, tugging gently on the leash, but Shadow didn't budge. His ears stood firm, his body coiled with purpose. If Daniels pulled harder, the dog would resist, not out of disobedience, but conviction. And Daniels knew better than to doubt him. On the defense table, the accused shifted again. His lips pressed thin, his hand tightening on the armrest, as if the very sight of the animal unnerved him. The dog's gaze didn't waver, and every subtle flinch from the man seemed to confirm something only Shadow understood. A juror coughed, breaking the tension for a second, but the reprieve was brief. The room leaned forward, hanging on the scene like an audience watching theater that felt too real, too raw. The prosecutor finally cleared his throat. "Your Honor, with respect, this is not a matter of theatrics. Officer Daniels K9 is a recognized tool of investigation. His reactions have been admissible in preliminary stages of this case. If he's responding now, in this courtroom, we can't ignore it. Objection." The defense lawyer nearly shouted, his face reddening. "This is a disgrace to due process. Dogs are not witnesses, and 3-year-olds are not experts. Are we to derail the foundations of justice on superstition?" But his words rang hollow against the energy in the room. The judge leaned back, his chair groaning beneath him. He rubbed his temple, his eyes flickering from the dog to the child, then to the defendant. The gavel rested in his hand like an anchor he wasn't sure how to use. "Order," he muttered, though no one truly believed order could be restored now. Shadow's handler, compelled by something larger than procedure, broke the silence. His voice was steady but low, carrying a weight that drew every ear. "Your Honor, my partner only reacts this way when he detects a person tied directly to the scene. It's rare, but when he fixates, it's because he recognizes a scent, a sound, or something else he cannot ignore. And he has never been wrong." The defendant's jaw tightened. His knuckles whitened as his hand gripped the edge of the table. He avoided Shadow's stare, looking instead at the judge, then the floor, then anywhere but the piercing amber gaze that seemed to strip him bare. The toddler, still standing on the bench, leaned forward as if confirming what only she and the dog could see. She whispered again, louder this time, "Doggy knows him." Gasps erupted. The mother tried to hush her daughter, nearly trembling with embarrassment, but the words had already set the room ablaze. Jurors leaned forward, reporters' pens scratched furiously, and the judge's face drained of color. The defense lawyer slammed his palm on the table. "This is outrageous. A child's babble cannot be treated as testimony. This entire display is prejudicial, but he was cut off by Shadow's sudden growl. It was low, primal, vibrating through the wooden floor and into the marrow of every person present. Not an aggressive snarl, but a warning of voice. Only he could give. His gaze never left the defendant. The sound froze the defense attorney mid-sentence. It silenced the whispers in the gallery. It pulled every nerve taut, demanding acknowledgement. Daniel's pulse hammered. He tightened the leash, but not to restrain, only to remind Shadow that he wasn't alone. Yet Daniels himself could feel it too. The dog was right. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The judge sat motionless for a long moment, his gavel untouched. His mind raced. Procedure screamed at him to dismiss the moment, to declare it irrelevant, to protect the sanctity of due process. But human instinct, whispered otherwise. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy. "Officer Daniels, bring the canine forward." A collective murmur rippled through the room. The defense attorney's protests rose again, but the judge cut him off with a raised hand. "Enough. This court will not be disrupted further, but neither will it ignore what is unfolding. Proceed." Daniels hesitated only a second before nodding. "Yes, Your Honor." He gave Shadow the quiet command to heel. The dog obeyed, rising smoothly to his feet, every muscle still taut with intensity. Together, handler and partner moved toward the defense table. Each step echoed like a drumbeat in the silence. The defendant shifted back in his chair, his breathing quickening. His eyes darted to the exits, then to the jury, then back to the dog that now approached him with steady, deliberate precision. Sweat glistened on his brow, and his hand trembled against the wood of the table. Shadow stopped just short of the defendant, sitting once more, his gaze unwavering. Then he lifted his nose, inhaled deeply, and released another low growl, pointed and certain. The courtroom erupted. Jurors gasped, the gallery murmured, and even the bailiff stiffened. The judge slammed the gavel. "Order!" he thundered, though his voice quivered beneath the weight of what they all understood. He looked at the defendant, then at the handler, then back at the child who sat calmly now, her small hand resting against her mother's arm. The girl smiled faintly, as if reassured. "Doggy knows," she whispered one final time. The words seemed less like a statement now, and more like a verdict. And in that moment, the trial ceased to be about evidence alone. It became about truth, unavoidable, undeniable truth that had found its way into the room through the innocence of a child and the loyalty of a dog. The defendant's shoulders slumped. For the first time since the trial began, his mask of control cracked. He wiped at his brow, his lips parting as though words might come, but none did. The dog had spoken in the only way he could, and everyone had heard him. The defendant's face had lost its color. A slick sheen of sweat glistened across his forehead. The starch of his shirt collar darkened where perspiration seeped through. For weeks he had sat in that courtroom with the poise of a man convinced of his own control. But now, under the unrelenting stare of the canine, his confidence cracked like glass, struck too hard. The courtroom was electric. No one breathed too loudly. No one shifted in their seat. They were watching a man unravel in real time. And the tension fed on itself, pulling everyone deeper into the spectacle. The judge studied him intently, chin resting on his hand. He said nothing, but his silence was louder than any gavel strike. At the defense table, the attorney leaned toward his client, whispering harshly, "Pull it together. They're watching you. Ignore the dog." But the words fell flat. The defendant's eyes kept darting back to the German shepherd, whose low growl had faded, but whose amber gaze remained locked on him with terrifying certainty. Across the gallery, the toddler rested her head against her mother's arm, her eyes heavy but still fixed on the scene. She had said all she needed to. "Doggy knows," and everyone believed her. The prosecutor rose from his seat with measured calm. "Your Honor, the state requests a brief recess to confer regarding this development." His tone was steady, but his eyes gleamed with something more opportunity. The judge tapped the gavel lightly. 5 minutes. Court is in recess." The words echoed, and the spell seemed to break. The jurors stood, whispering amongst themselves, their faces etched with curiosity and unease. Reporters scrambled, their pens flying, some already stepping out to call their editors. Bailiffs moved closer to the defense table, their presence subtle but unmistakable. The defendant slumped back in his chair. His chest heaved with shallow breaths, as if the very air betrayed him. His lawyer placed a firm hand on his shoulder, whispering urgently, but the man barely heard him. His ears were filled with the sound of the dog's growl, still vibrating in his bones. He pressed a trembling hand to his temple. "It's just a dog," he muttered under his breath. "It's just a stupid dog." But the words didn't convince even him. Officer Daniels crouched beside Shadow, giving the dog a soft pat on the flank. Shadow's muscles had relaxed slightly, but his eyes never wavered from the defendant. Daniels leaned close, whispering so only his partner could hear. "Good boy, you've got him, don't you?" "You know." The defendant's gaze flickered. At the words, his lips twitching as if he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the courage. When the recess ended and the judge returned, the energy in the courtroom hadn't settled. It had intensified. The jurors filed back in, their faces flushed with anticipation. The gallery stilled, reporters clutching pens like weapons. The defendant looked worse. His tie hung crooked, his hair damp against his forehead. He fidgeted with his hands, his fingers twisting, knuckles cracking one by one. The prosecutor rose again. "Your Honor, while the defense may object to the relevance of the K-9's behavior, the state cannot ignore the defendant's visible reaction. His discomfort is not that of a man falsely accused. It is the demeanor of someone who knows he has been found out." The defense attorney shot up. "Objection. That is speculation, pure and simple." "Sustained," the judge replied, though his tone lacked its usual firmness. His eyes remained fixed on the defendant, watching, studying. The prosecutor didn't miss a beat. "Very well. Then let's return to the facts." He approached the witness stand, retrieving a piece of evidence, a photograph of the crime scene. "Mr. Hayes," he said, turning toward the defendant, "would you care to explain why this location, your alleged alibi, was found with your fingerprints? Despite your sworn testimony, you had never been there?" The defendant's throat bobbed. His lips parted, but no sound came. He reached for water, his hand shaking so badly the glass rattled against the pitcher. A few drops spilled onto the table, spreading like cracks across the polished wood. "Answer the question," the prosecutor pressed, voice steady but sharp. The defense attorney interjected, "My client is not obligated to testify." But before he could finish, the defendant slammed the glass down, water splashing across the table. "Enough," he snapped, his voice breaking the fragile quiet. Gasps erupted across the courtroom. His lawyer's eyes widened, panic flashing across his face. "Don't," but it was too late. The defendant rose to his feet, hands braced on the table, his chest heaving. "I've listened to this circus long enough. A mutt stares at me, and suddenly I'm guilty? A toddler mumbles nonsense, and the whole court believes her?" His voice dripped with rage, but beneath it trembled fear. The jurors recoiled. Some exchanged uneasy glances, others scribbled furiously on their notepads. The judge slammed his gavel. "Sit down, Mr. Hayes. Control yourself." But Hayes couldn't. His face twisted with something raw, unguarded. His hands trembled as they slammed the table again. "You think you know the truth? You don't know anything." His voice cracked on the last word, the facade of calm authority shattering completely. Shadow growled again, louder this time, the sound filling the chamber like a drumbeat of truth. The toddler stirred, her wide eyes locking on the defendant, as though she'd been waiting for this moment. The silence that followed was deafening. The judge's eyes narrowed, his tone low but cutting. "Mr. Hayes, your behavior is telling this jury far more than any witness could. You will sit down, or I will hold you in contempt." Hayes hesitated, his chest rising and falling like a man drowning on dry land. Slowly, shakily, he sank back into his seat, his lawyer's hand gripping his arm in a futile attempt to steady him. But the damage was done. The jurors had seen it, the cracks in his composure, the fear in his eyes, the guilt that no objection could erase. The gallery had seen it too, their murmurs rising like the tide, unstoppable. The prosecutor returned to his table, satisfied. He didn't need to press further. The dog and the child had spoken without words. And now the defendant had spoken too, not with truth, but with the kind of panic only the guilty revealed. The judge struck his gavel once more, his voice measured but heavy. "Proceed. This court will hear the rest of the evidence. But let it be clear, this trial has taken a turn." As the echoes faded, Shadow's eyes remained fixed on Hayes. His ears flicked once, and then he lay down at Danielle's feet, resting, his head on his paws, calm again, as if he knew the battle was already won. And across the courtroom, the toddler finally closed her eyes, her tiny body slumping against her mother. To her, it was simple. The dog had known the truth. Now, everyone else did too. The courtroom felt different now. What had once been a place of controlled procedure was transformed into a stage where truth and lies wrestled in the open, no longer confined to evidence folders and sworn testimony. The air itself seemed charged, as if everyone inside could sense that something buried was about to rise to the surface. The defendant Hayes sat hunched at the defense table, his knuckles white against the polished wood. His earlier outburst had stripped away the polished veneer he'd worn throughout the trial. No amount of whispered advice from his attorney could patch the cracks. The jurors had seen too much. Shadow, the police dog, lay at Officer Daniel's feet, his body relaxed, but his eyes still fixed on Hayes. The steady amber gaze was unrelenting, an unspoken message that only seemed to tighten the noose around the defendant's composure. The prosecutor rose again, this time carrying a thin folder. His movements were deliberate, purposeful. He didn't look at Hayes as he walked, but his voice carried the weight of inevitability. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, his tone calm. "We have heard testimony, examined evidence, and debated alibis. But sometimes the truth reveals itself in unexpected ways. Today, that truth began with a child's words and a dog's reaction. And now the evidence will follow." He opened the folder, sliding a set of photographs onto the evidence table. A bailiff retrieved them, passing copies to the jurors. The images were grainy, but clear enough. A burned jacket, partially unearthed in a wooded area. On its charred fabric, faint traces of blood shimmered under ultraviolet light. The jurors leaned in, whispering amongst themselves. Hayes stiffened, his jaw clenching so tightly a muscle twitched near his ear. "This jacket," the prosecutor continued, "was found less than a mile from Mr. Hayes's home. Forensic testing confirms it belonged to him. And the blood? It belongs to the victim." Gasps erupted in the gallery. The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection. This evidence was not presented in discovery." The prosecutor cut him off smoothly. "On the contrary, counsel, it was disclosed. Perhaps you overlooked the supplemental file submitted last week. But the state has been waiting for the appropriate moment to introduce it. And what better moment than when the defendant himself has already revealed his guilt through his behavior?" The judge raised a hand. "Enough. Objection overruled. The evidence stands." Hayes swallowed hard. His eyes darted toward the jury, then back to the photographs, then to the dog that had yet to blink. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The prosecutor stepped closer to the defense table. "You see, ladies and gentlemen, animals like Shadow are not bound by our rules of testimony. They know what they know. And children, in their innocence, speak truths we adults are too blind or too corrupt to face. But science? Science fills the gap. And in this case, it points in only one direction. The jurors scribbled furiously, their faces grim. Hayes's lawyer leaned toward him, whispering frantically. But Hayes shook his head, his face pale. He was sweating so profusely, now that dark stains spread under his arms. His breathing quickened, uneven and ragged, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Then the prosecutor delivered the final blow. He held up a small, clear evidence bag. Inside lay a silver locket, tarnished but intact, recovered from the lining of that same jacket. The victim's initials are engraved inside. Mr. Hayes, care to explain why this locket reported missing by the victim's family was found hidden in your coat? The room erupted again. Jurors gasped audibly, one clutching a hand to her chest. The gallery buzzed, voices hissing through the air like sparks. Hayes's face crumpled. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, "No, no, no." The judge slammed his gavel. "Order! This courtroom will remain silent." But Hayes couldn't stay silent. He stood suddenly, knocking his chair backward with a crash. His lawyer reached for his sleeve, but Hayes yanked away, eyes wild. "It wasn't supposed to go like this," he shouted, his voice cracking. The prosecutor froze. The judge's eyes widened. The jurors leaned forward, hardly breathing. Hayes's chest heaved as he pointed a trembling finger at Shadow. "That dog. He saw me. He knows." The words hung in the air like a confession wrapped in denial. Daniel straightened, his hand tightening on the leash. Shadow growled low again, not out of aggression, but confirmation. The sound rumbled across the chamber like thunder. The judge's voice cut through, stern and sharp. "Mr. Hayes, are you admitting involvement in this crime?" Hayes faltered, his lips quivering. I... He couldn't finish. His voice broke into a sob, his shoulders shaking under the weight of his unraveling. His attorney buried his face in his hands. The jurors stared, some wide-eyed, others grim, as though they were witnessing not just guilt, but the collapse of a man's entire facade. The toddler stirred again, lifting her head just enough to look across the room. Her small voice pierced the silence. "Doggy told me. It wasn't a lie." Children didn't lie with such conviction. The gallery gasped once more, a sound like the whole room inhaling at once. The judge leaned back heavily in his chair, his gavel resting loosely in his hand. He looked at Hayes, at the locket, at the dog lying calmly, as though justice had finally arrived. "Mr. Hayes," he said at last, his voice firm, "you have the right to remain silent. And perhaps now you should use it." Hayes sank back into his chair, his face buried in his hands. His body shook, not from rage now, but from the inevitability of his fate. The prosecutor returned to his table, satisfied but solemn. The jurors would deliberate, of course, but the truth was already laid bare. Between the child, the dog, and the evidence, the verdict had been written before the trial could even end. And for the first time since it began, the courtroom exhaled. The courtroom air had grown thick with anticipation. Even the sun seemed to hesitate at the windows, its light trembling across the benches like hesitant fingers. Hayes sat slumped at the defense table, his hands covering his face, shoulders, trembling with a combination of fear, shame, and rage. He had tried to maintain control, tried to appear untouchable, but the moment had come when even the strongest mask could not hold. Shadow remained at Officer Daniel's side, lying with impeccable discipline. Though his eyes never left Hayes, the amber gaze was unwavering, patient, yet full of silent accusation. Every so often, a low growl vibrated from deep in the dog's chest, a warning, a confirmation, a truth the man could no longer deny. The gallery was tense, spectators holding their collective breath. Reporters scribbled furiously, the scratch of pens sounding louder than the murmurs of the jurors. Every whisper, every shuffle, seemed magnified in the charged silence. The toddler leaned slightly against her mother, her wide eyes bright with the clarity only a child could possess. She had spoken, and now she waited, as though the world itself had paused for her words to take effect. Doggy knows. The prosecutor approached once more, calm and unhurried, his eyes locking on Hayes. "Sir," he said, voice smooth but edged with authority. "You have heard the testimony, seen the evidence, and witnessed reactions in this courtroom that cannot be ignored. This is your opportunity to speak. Tell us the truth." Hayes lifted his head, revealing a face etched with panic. Sweat streaked down his temple, his eyes darting from the prosecutor to the judge, then to the dog, and finally to the child. Every glance chipped away at his defenses. His lips trembled, trying to form words, but none would come. "You," he stammered, voice cracking. "You all think you understand." His hands flew to the table, gripping its edge as if it were the only anchor in a storm. "It's not what you think." The prosecutor stepped closer. "Then explain, mister." "Hayes, help the jury understand why your fingerprints were on the jacket, why the victim's locket was in your possession. Help us understand why your reactions betray knowledge only the guilty would show." The defendant's head fell forward again, his fingers clutching the edges of the table until his nails bit into the wood. The room waited, silent except for the subtle hum of the ventilation system. And then, without warning, Hayes broke. He rose to his feet with a violent jerk, chair scraping loudly across the floor. "It was an accident. I didn't mean for—" His words choked off into sobs. His body shook uncontrollably, and for the first time, the courtroom saw the man behind the arrogance and pretense. Vulnerable, human, guilty. The jurors recoiled slightly, some leaning back in their seats, others wide-eyed. The gallery murmured, though nobody dared to speak too loudly. Even the defense attorney looked helpless, standing frozen as his client's breakdown unfolded. "Enough," the judge barked, gavel striking the bench. His voice carried authority, yet the tremor in it betrayed a rare unease. "Sit down, Mr. Hayes. Control yourself, or you will be held in contempt of court." Hayes sank into his chair, head buried in his hands. But it was too late. His breakdown had already spoken volumes. The jury's perception of him had shifted, irreversibly. The calm and collected facade was gone, replaced by guilt that shone brighter than any evidence could. Shadow lifted his head, ears flicking forward. The low growl returned, resonating like a heartbeat in the chamber. Daniel's hand tightened slightly on the leash, a reminder that the dog's attention was still keen, still deliberate. The prosecutor leaned against the lectern, his voice softening, almost conversational. "Sir, you see this courtroom has witnessed something unusual today. A child, innocent and untainted by deceit, and a dog, trained to sense truth, have revealed what you tried to hide. Now it's your choice. Continue hiding or acknowledge the truth." Hayes shook his head violently. Tears streamed down his face, his sobs now audible to everyone. I didn't mean for it to happen," he cried. "It was supposed to be just a mistake. I didn't want anyone hurt." The jurors exchanged glances. The defense attorney looked stricken, realizing that cross-examination and legal arguments were now secondary to the raw, emotional confession unfolding before them. The judge leaned forward, hands clasped. "Mr. Hayes, take a deep breath. Speak clearly. The court will record whatever you say. But know that honesty now may be your only path forward." Hayes trembled, nodding. His words were ragged, each one weighted with guilt. I didn't plan it. The victim, we argued. I didn't mean to hurt them. I didn't want any of this. His voice broke completely. He collapsed onto the table, sobbing. The gallery held their breath again, stunned by the intensity of his confession. A toddler stirred slightly, sensing the shift. She looked toward Shadow, who remained calm but alert. His ears flicked, acknowledging her presence as if to say, "You were right. He is guilty." Officer Daniels kept the dog under control, but his mind raced. He had been part of many cases, witnessed confessions, arrests, and confrontations, but never had a dog's instincts and a child's insight precipitated a breakdown like this. The prosecutor stepped closer, now crouching slightly to address Hayes without menace. "Sir, the evidence corroborates your statement. Your reaction, your guilt, your fear all align with what we know. The jury will now see a complete picture, including your admission." Hayes's voice wavered, almost inaudible now. I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. It was supposed to be temporary. I just wanted them gone for a little while. I swear, I didn't mean. The words trailed off, leaving the courtroom in an almost surreal silence. Even the bailiffs, trained to remain stoic, exchanged subtle glances. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, regaining composure. "The record will reflect the defendant's statements. The jury may consider this in their deliberations. Let the proceedings continue." As the judge returned to the bench, Shadow rose slowly, muscles rippling beneath his coat, and moved a step closer to Hayes, the amber eyes locked once more. Delivering the silent truth the child had first recognized, guilt could not hide from loyalty, instinct, or innocence. The toddler, too young to understand the complexities of the law, understood perfectly. She whispered to her mother, voice calm but resolute, "Doggy told me he did it." The courtroom fell silent again. The weight of those words, paired with Hayes's emotional collapse and the dog's steadfast focus, made it impossible to ignore the magnitude of what had just occurred. For the first time, everyone understood that the trial had shifted. No longer was it merely a debate of evidence. It had become a revelation of truth, undeniable and irrefutable. And in that moment, it was clear. The combination of childlike honesty, canine instinct, and human emotion had laid bare what lies, no matter how carefully constructed, could never hide. The courtroom was heavy with tension as the jury filed back into their seats. Each juror carried the weight of what they had witnessed. Hayes unraveling, the irrefutable evidence, and the silent but commanding presence of Shadow, the police dog whose instincts had guided the truth into the open. The toddler, perched quietly on her mother's lap, looked toward the jury with wide eyes, as if aware that their decision would honor what she had spoken so plainly. "Doggy knows." The judge rapped the gavel twice, his voice filling the room. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a lined but resolute face, nodded. She stood slowly, folding her hands before her. The air was taut with expectation, each heartbeat amplified in the collective silence. "We have your honor," she said, her voice steady but solemn. The defendant Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His earlier breakdown had left him pale and shaking. His eyes flicked to the toddler, who sat still, her small hand clutching her mother's arm. He noticed Shadow sitting upright, alert yet calm, and a wave of dread passed over him. The dog's amber eyes bore into his soul, as if saying, "Justice will be served." The foreperson began to speak, each word deliberate. "We, the jury, find the defendant." She paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. "Guilty of all charges." A murmur swept through the courtroom, quickly suppressed by the gavel. The mother instinctively pulled her daughter closer, tears forming in her eyes. A toddler tilted her head slightly, a faint smile tugging at her lips, as though she understood. Her small voice had contributed to the unraveling of the truth. Hayes slumped into his chair, his face buried in his hands. His lips trembled, no sound coming from his throat, only the quiet realization that the facade he had built was gone. Forever. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering words that fell on deaf ears. Hayes was consumed by the enormity of what had just happened. The judge's voice cut through the silence. The jury has spoken. Mr. Hayes, the court will now proceed with sentencing at a later date. But let it be noted that the jury's decision reflects not only the tangible evidence, but also the unyielding pursuit of truth, as demonstrated today in a most extraordinary manner. A few heads tilted toward Shadow, who had remained perfectly still during the announcement, yet every movement, every flick of an ear, conveyed an unspoken authority. He had guided the courtroom toward the truth, long before the verdict was read. The gallery erupted in whispered conversations. Reporters jostled to scribble notes, their pens flying across pads like birds taking flight. Cameras flashed, capturing the rare convergence of innocence, instinct, and justice in a single frame. The toddler, feeling the moment's gravity, leaned back slightly. She whispered, almost to herself, "Doggy knew it." Her mother smiled through tears, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's forehead. "Yes, sweetie," she murmured. Doggy knew. Daniels, the officer, gave Shadow a quiet pat. The dog responded with a soft wag of his tail, his body relaxing now that the verdict had brought closure. "Good boy," Daniels whispered. "You did your job." The prosecutor nodded at the dog, a faint smile crossing his face. "Remarkable," he said quietly. "You've changed the outcome of a case without saying a word." The defense attorney sighed, shaking his head. "I've never seen anything like this," he muttered, muttering in disbelief at the combination of human error, childlike insight, and canine instinct that had brought his client down. Hayes was escorted from the courtroom, his face still pale, his hands restrained but trembling. The weight of the verdict pressed down on him, as if the air itself had thickened. He cast one final glance at the toddler and the dog, a mix of fear and resignation in his eyes. Shadow's amber gaze met his one last time, and in that moment, Hayes understood that nothing could hide from truth, not even him. The courtroom gradually began to empty, but the atmosphere lingered, heavy with the memory of what had transpired. Jurors lingered, talking quietly amongst themselves, still processing the extraordinary events that had unfolded. Reporters filed their notes, aware that the story would make headlines across the nation. The mother lifted her daughter from the bench, holding her tightly as they walked toward the exit. The toddler looked back at Shadow one last time, giving him a small wave. Daniels returned the gesture, a faint grin on his face. It had been a long day, and though the courtroom had witnessed something extraordinary, the dog's work was never done. But today, justice had been served. Outside, the sunlight felt warmer, brighter, as if the world itself was acknowledging the resolution. The toddler skipped slightly in her mother's hand, her small voice cheerful. "Doggy helped." "She?" exclaimed. "Yes, he did," her mother replied, smiling through tears. "Yes, he did?" Inside the now empty courtroom, Shadow sat calmly by Daniel's side, ears flicking to the sound of departing footsteps. The officer gave him a scratch behind the ears, whispering, "Good work today, partner. We couldn't have done it without you." Shadow's tail thumped gently against the floor, a silent acknowledgement of the day's extraordinary events. Even the judge lingered briefly, staring at the empty defense table. In all his years on the bench, he had never presided over a trial where a child and a dog had played such pivotal roles. The echo of their impact would linger long after the gavel fell, and for the toddler, the world was simple again. The dog had known the truth. She had spoken the words that revealed it. And justice, in the most unusual of ways, had been done. As the courtroom lights dimmed and the final echoes faded, it was clear to everyone present that some truths do not require words, only the courage to listen, whether to a child, a dog, or the quiet signals that speak louder than any testimony.